The Seventh Saga is one of many role-playing games released for the SNES during the console's humble beginnings, and its reputation is probably what it's best known for. It's said to be extremely unforgiving and downright unfair at times, and has been rumored to be one of the hardest RPG experiences of its generation. A big part of this is the difficulty of the North American release being much less balanced than the Japanese one titled Elnard. At the same level in both games, your stats are much lower in the North American version, so it takes a lot more work to achieve the same rewards that you'd see in the Japanese game. There's a balance patch that exists to sidestep some of this, but I came to the Seventh Saga in its natural state. The backstory to the game is begun in the manual. A grave warning has been found in the form of a long-lost book in a cave high up in the mountains. The barely legible texts told of two men that waged war with one another for many years in a battle for the land of Ticonderoga. Sorrow, the defender of the land, seemed to be losing the battle, and the game's introduction skips ahead in time to King Lemely, recruiting 7 apprentices to send out in a search for the runes that have been scattered all over the world. One of the greatest things about the Seventh Saga is how different each of the 7 characters that you can play as are. First of all, each individual has their own aspirations for wanting to track down the runes, from the selflessness in someone like Valsu, who wants to rid the world of evil using their power, all the way to someone like Ledges, who wants to use them for personal gain to overthrow the king. While we get a little insight into the minds of a few of the apprentices in the manual, after meeting with King Lemely, there's an opportunity to hear a little more from each of the others. While their motivations aren't super important from a gameplay perspective, it was neat to have an opportunity to choose a character that perhaps aligns with your own personal tastes or personality. There are a few consequences in who you choose, like the ease by which you can recruit another person from the group to join you later, or even how people in towns respond or act around you as you make your way throughout the world. And while I've only played through once, seeing these small differences in a subsequent playthrough might offer some replay value. Apart from their backstories, each potential hero for your quest has their own unique set of attributes that may guide your choice further. For my playthrough, what pushed me to choose the dwarf character Olvin as my main warrior was split between his story and his balanced skill set. He wants to use the runes to try to become young again, and on paper, he had reasonable magic potential and very strong offense and defense. If there's one thing that I've experienced in older RPGs, it's that the beginning is usually the hardest when you're just learning the game and you're likely to get torn to pieces faster than a dry napkin at a rib dinner buffet. I've heard the same story from a lot of people about getting completely obliterated right outside of the city of Lemely, but I was able to overcome the first area quite easily. I'm not sure if it's because I had some kind of advantage with Olvin, but I did what I just do in most games. I left town, I fought a few fights, and I came back in to heal up, and then repeated that until I felt confident enough to wander a little further, and then leveled some more. It was no different from starting up other RPGs like Miracle Warriors or Phantasy Star for the Sega Master System, and it was a great feeling seeing how a few levels could make a huge difference in my performance in combat. The battles in the Seventh Saga are probably one of my favorite parts of the game for a few reasons, but the way that you get into these encounters is different than many games with purely random fights or others where you can physically see enemies in the environments that you're walking through. Anytime you're on the overworld, the crystal ball that King Lemely gives you acts as a radar that shows you enemies patrolling the area and any important locations that you might need to go to. The encounters are magnetized to you, so it's very difficult to avoid getting into fights, and this becomes even harder in caves and buildings where the paths that you're taking are tight without a lot of room to maneuver. Springing into action puts you into a turn-based third-person perspective mode where you're left to your own devices to figure out how to terminate your opponents, and that's where the fun truly begins. Combat is extremely variable. There are enemies with impenetrable defense, some that are resistant to magic, and others that come in packing a punch so hard that they'll kill you almost instantly before you even have time to think. This is far from a game where you can just mash attack each turn and be successful, and careful planning is required in even the most mundane overworld encounter. While this might feel mind-numbing to some since you fight the same enemies a lot, figuring out how they tick and how to best defend yourself against their attacks was exciting. There are no two types of monsters that act exactly the same way, and finding out how to derail their efforts kept me on my toes. One quirky thing about the fight sequences is that selecting Defend actually does something useful here, in addition to what the manual's description says it does. Choosing it for one turn also translates into an increase in attack the next, and while it leaves you susceptible to enemy bombardment and lengthens the battles, it's completely worth it to use it every time. I'm actually flabbergasted at why the developers would have chosen to implement a strength boost like this. It's not even remotely intuitive for first-time players, and it felt cumbersome to have to take that extra step every other turn. On the bright side, at least it exists and it works pretty well. I was in love with the enemy design in the 7th Saga. There are no cartoony encounters to be found here, and every single battle is up against things from your wildest nightmares. While most of them appear to be dancing along to what can only be described as a knockout soundtrack, they have a variety of animations depending on what they're doing in battle. Some of my favorite designs were the giant spiders or the scarier enemies in later parts of the game that came with many risks to your party, like this decrepit antlered beast or any palette swap on this guy that could absolutely wreck you. While I wish there'd been a larger varieties in enemies overall, what was there was totally unique as far as ferocious beasts go. Your own character's actions in battle were also what I would consider excitingly animated. I loved the conjured up winds whenever Alvin would cast heal, or the fantastical feel of my partner Lux's spells. It was nice that there was quite a bit of thought put into the battle visuals, since you'll have to look at them a lot. As fun as the battles felt, nothing scared me more than their difficulty. Stumbling upon a super strong mimic at the end of a long stretch with a sliver of life left, or seeing the screen fade to black as a fiend attempted to cast an instant death spell called Vacuum, always had me hovering on the edge of my seat. You could just be wandering along, fighting the good fights, when all of a sudden out of nowhere you're just dead. While it was obviously not ideal to have to play through the same areas multiple times, if you did happen to fall in battle, the only penalty was losing half the money you'd gained and having to make the walk of shame back there to try again. You get to keep your experience, which is incredibly generous in a game where you can get turned upside down and shaken out over a bit of bad luck versus having to revert back to your last save and losing it all. I've played a lot of RPGs where you just go from point A to point B, go through some motions, and land on the victory without even really having to aim. All the battles in the 7th Saga, with all the uncertainty that came with them, was a welcome challenge from much of the mediocrity I've experienced elsewhere in this generation of gaming. They forced me to think, plan ahead, and be calculated in a way that I haven't really experienced much since playing Ultima IV on the Sega Master System. Most people's biggest complaint about the difficulty is the seemingly endless grind. In the first part of the adventure for me, playing blind and wandering around naturally trying to find the next thing to do was enough to keep me on par with the fight difficulty. But I will say that there were several significant walls that I hit later on, especially when money became a real obstacle. Purchasing upgrades is very costly and money's far from easy to come by, especially in places where death is going to find you around every corner. My longest stretch of grinding was in an area where there were some substantial armor and weapon improvements for one of my characters, and I think I spent around 5 hours beating down the same few monsters before I'd raised an obscene amount of gold in the tens of thousands. The mixture of the types of random encounters in that area also contributed to the stall, since almost every other random battle had either these horrible blue monsters that decimated my party or others that could cast vacuum. I died and died and died some more, and this was the only part of the whole thing that didn't feel fun. Had I not had the company of people in my live streams, I'm not sure that I would have wanted to push all the way through that on my own. The 7th Saga allows you to recruit one other character at a time to join your main warrior on their quest, and though I don't exactly understand what makes them join you or not, I ended up recruiting Lux when I first found him. I was getting absolutely creamed walking around on the overworld, and rather than kissing the ground some more, I eventually chose him. He wasn't my first choice though. Something I wish I'd known when starting the game is that each of your rivals can present an opportunity to battle with them when you speak to them, and if you choose to engage in battle, they'll never be able to be recruited. Before I knew this, I'd read that sometimes encountering a rival that wanted to fight you meant that they had a rune for the taking, so when I spoke to Asuna, the mage character that I desperately wanted for a partner, I thought I'd have to fight her to win her over or something. It turns out that the moment that I entered battle with her, win or lose, she could never become my comrade. I ended up settling for Lux again because of his pure of heart story, and mostly because he could take hits like a tank. He saved me, and while an Ulvin and Lux combination was tricky in some stretches of the game, he was a valiant partner. The only annoying part was how slow he was, but also how he clanged so loudly over the awesome town music whenever we'd be exploring somewhere new. It just gave me even more reasons to stand still every so often and take in the scenery and atmosphere. I mentioned earlier that the story in the 7th Saga is fairly limited. After the introduction, you and your friend, if you choose to bring someone along that is, wander from town to town speaking to NPCs and attempt to dig up information on the location of the runes. Progressing is very direct, with new areas and plot advancements occurring only after specific tasks have been fulfilled. This isn't so bad since the land of Tichondra is enormous, and I appreciated the focus that the story imparts. There were very few times where I was confused about where to go next or what to do, but the localization, while not perfect, was good enough to nudge me in the right direction. It was leaps and bounds ahead of games like Breath of Fire or Illusion of Gaia in that department. Also helpful is that there's practically no backtracking here, and anytime I got stuck, I knew that a clue was probably lying with someone I just hadn't found yet, usually at the back of an inn for some reason, or that there was a new area to explore that I needed to brave my way to. As someone who thrives in routine and predictability, I felt that keeping each leg of the journey relatively separate from the others was perfect. One gripe that I do have with this game is the search function. This is some next level crypticness that would like to see you manually search every single square of every location that you go through to find items. There's no indication whatsoever that anything's even lying there, and the locations are not always obvious ones that you'd think to check, like the end of a dead-end corridor or next to a piece of furniture. Some things were stashed in the middle of a room in a random spot. Thankfully, none of these secret items are of much consequence in terms of plot progression, and many are things that you can purchase at a shop. However, some are the seeds that give your characters permanent stat upgrades. These are the ultimate treasure in a game that already punishes you and your stat progression if you're playing the North American version, and it felt malicious to put some of them completely out of sight like that. Without a guide or a lot of time to kill, leaving no stone unturned, I don't imagine anyone would be able to find everything, or want to for that matter. Dungeons and caves and the exploration that accompanied them were actually quite pleasant in terms of their straightforwardness. There were no excruciating experiences that were particularly confusing or difficult to navigate, and any problems came from the enemies lying in wait. This will sound like something really small on the grand scheme of things, but I really enjoyed that when you came out of a battle, that your party was facing the same direction that you were walking when you entered. Some games turn your character to face a different direction, and this was just one less thing that I had to worry about when navigating some of these places. The smooth design of the caves did not always extend to towns, and one of the most infuriating places was the town of Bone. It's so hard to tell how to get to the different shops since staircases are all indoors here. You have to go through shops or houses to get to the different areas, and sometimes you don't even know that you can access other parts of them because they don't look like you should be able to pass through underneath something. The perspective here is all out of whack, and with several important plot driving points to find, just getting around wasted a lot of my time trying to find them. Fighting bosses in the 7th Saga was completely underwhelming when compared to the intensity of the overworld battles. Sure, boss HP was typically higher than the average encounter in the world above, and the fights took longer, but if you were leveled enough, these jerks didn't have too many tricks up their sleeves. I think a big part of why these fights felt easier was that you were usually only ever up against one entity. Having a single target to attack and have attack you made planning and resource management a lot easier than, say, running into 2 or 3 horrible enemies that keep resurrecting their friends in a later area affectionately known as the Murder Cave by many. Brute force in boss encounters was not always the best strategy though, and some of these battles required finding an item to expose a weakness. There were a few occasions where I didn't realize this was the case until I was already facing off with a monster and was unable to make a dent in its health. Because I'm usually extremely thorough making my way through caves and dungeons, I rarely turned up to a fight empty-handed, but I imagine this could be frustrating for the type of person that just wants to be able to fight using pure grit instead of sniffing out some special item stashed randomly under a table somewhere. Speaking of items, as was the case for many other games at the time, there are no in-game descriptions for any consumables available for purchase. On the bright side, the back of the included map has everything that you need to know and then some, including what all of the different spells do and even some information on some of the available armor and weapons. I would say that if you've played other RPGs, the names of the spells definitely make sense, but what any of the items did by name alone was not clear at all. For example, a mirror might make sense to reflect petrification attempts back onto the casters, but who would have ever thought that harps could repel instant death spells called vacuum, or that the first time you run into what can only be assumed to be protect or destroy, there's so little context, and because every shop sells different items, in a first playthrough it's hard to justify testing them out in battle when you have no idea if or when you'll be able to buy more. It's unfortunate that none of this information's in the manual, and it must have been a nightmare for anybody that rented the game and didn't have access to these materials. In my experience, RPGs tend to fall into a few main categories that make them great, and the 7th Saga fits nicely into the group that has excellent gameplay with a quaint but captivating narrative. It misses out on an opportunity to really develop its characters, and has some absolutely horrible stretches that you'll feel you'll never be able to climb up out of until you do. But I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that it's a good game in spite of all that, and maybe is even one of my favorite experiences so far from the SNES library. Is it grind heavy? Yeah, it is, but so is every other RPG from this era. The highly strategic combat and some unexpected story surprises as everything rolls out are more than enough to keep a player's gears turning. But one of its strongest suits is that it's probably one of the most customizable RPG experiences to be had on the SNES, with the many character combinations that you can test the waters of Tichondra with. While my experience might be more positive from others that have played with a riskier starting character, going through these tribulations with Olvin and Lux established the 7th Saga in my mind as a notably underrated video game experience that's been shrouded in rumors about insurmountable difficulty and unfair localization imbalances. There's a great game in there to experience, and if you aren't up for something with such an incremental slope for progress, you can always play the patched version or play a fan translation of Elnard. Regardless of how you play it, the 7th Saga is a compelling reincarnation of hardcore RPGs with all of their quirks and should not be missed.